My name is Isabel Bauman. I am on the faculty at Missouri State University in the Department of Communication, and I am here to cover the LGBTIQ portion of today's presentation. And I'm going to begin with a discussion of terminology, and then I'll talk a little bit about coming out and identity, and then just a little tiny bit about sexual development, because Jim's already talked extensively about that. A little bit about abuse and harassment, just a little bit, because Mickey's talked extensively about that. And then some about communication. Not so much as I might, because Kelly's going to be talking some about that. So let's talk a little bit about terminology, and most of what I'm going to be doing is unpacking that big long acronym LGBTIQ, and you can probably unpack the first piece of terminology. I'm sure you already know what the L is.
Lesbian?
Yeah. That's the lesbian. And as you probably already know, that's the woman who is sexually attracted to other women. Okay? G, gay. And gay stands for gay men, the man who's attracted to other men. It's also been used historically as an umbrella term to refer to the whole LGBTIQ spectrum. That's really not an appropriate use of the term gay. It's much more appropriately used to refer to gay men. There's a better umbrella term out there that I'll get to in a minute or two. It's more precise and more appropriate to use the term gay to refer to gay men. How about B? Bisexual. Bisexual refers to men or women who are equally sexually attracted to both same-sex and other sex partners. Now we're getting to the part of the acronym that may not be quite so familiar. You know the T? Transgender. Transgender. Transsexual actually means something more specific, and we'll talk a little bit later about the difference between transgender and transsexual, but transgender is the more general term. Transgender refers to the person who feels like they've been born into the wrong body. The person who's biologically born male but feels like they ought to have been female, or biologically been born female but feels like they ought to have been male. Okay? Now, I'll be kind of surprised if anybody knows the I. Anybody know the I? Okay, I'm not really surprised. One in the very back who knows the I. Intersex. Intersex. Intersex is the one term in this whole list that refers to this actual medical terminology. Intersex refers to anyone who has one of the variety of medical conditions that causes the body to differ from normal physical male or female development.
Yeah, my brother was born like that.
Okay, so that would be
Boy, but he had some female part.
okay. So somebody who would have primarily male physical characteristics, but some female physical characteristics, would be in the intersex spectrum. We'll talk more about intersex here in a minute, but that's a good example of somebody who would be in intersex. And Q actually has two terminologies associated with it. Anybody know what one or both of those are? Questioning. Questioning is one. Anybody know the other one? You might know it, but not be willing to say it.
Queer.
Queer is the other. Queer and questioning. Queer is actually the umbrella term that is in use today, that is more appropriately applied to the whole spectrum. And queer, and why you might not have been willing to say it, is that it used to be a very negative term that's been reappropriated by the LGBTIQ community as a term of pride. It used to be that the non-LGBTIQ community referred to them as, oh, you're just queer, as a very negative terminology. And they've really taken that term and gone, yeah, I'm queer. So what of it? I'm proud to be queer. That's a good thing. And so you'll have the LGBTIQ pride. People will say I'm queer, and that's kind of the umbrella term that's more in use today. Queer can also refer to someone who really calls into question society's definition of sexual orientation or gender identity. Questioning is a term that's more focused on sexual orientation, and it refers to somebody who really is unclear about what their sexual orientation is. They may not be strongly attracted to either same-sex or opposite-sex partners. Okay, so they would call themselves questioning. Then let's talk a little bit about identity, and we'll go into some more depth about each of those areas. And I want to begin by pointing out that these are all of them generally fairly high-risk groups. The LGB adolescents are 2 to 7 times more likely to attempt suicide than heterosexual adolescents. That's a pretty high, greater times more likely. And up to 1/3 of transgender people report making attempts at suicide. Okay, that's lifetime rather than adolescence. So with your group that you're dealing with, who generally tend to be a higher risk group, if you have LGBTIQ adolescents in your facilities who are already at risk, any of this population who end up in your facility are going to be at even higher risk than normal. Okay? So for our lesbian and gay, in terms of identity, this is going to generally develop around puberty, and it's going to generally develop in about the same way that sexual development happens as Jim outlined. Okay, so the sexual development of a lesbian and gay adolescent is going to happen in about the same way as the sexual development of other teens happened. So what Jim said typically applies. Okay, timeline, those kinds of things, it's going to generally happen. It may happen a little bit earlier. So for a lesbian or gay adolescent, they may become aware that they are different from their same-sex peers at a little bit earlier age than your heterosexual peer who may go along blithely, unaware of anything going on, okay, until puberty hits, okay? Or the other thing that can happen is that you get a long tail into adulthood where somebody may not become aware that they have a lesbian or gay identity until they are 30, 40, 50, okay? So I had a friend that I went to graduate school with who, in high school, she and her boyfriend came from very religious families who believed that no sexual activity at all. And both she and her boyfriend, high school sweetheart, bought into that. So they had no sexual activity. They went out together in high school. They went out together in college, no sexual activity. After college, they married. He tried to make it work. Took him about 5 years of marriage to figure out this isn't working for me. Another 3 years of desperately trying to make this work because he truly loved his wife. They were very best friends, and they genuinely, deeply loved each other. So about 8 years into marriage, when he finally realized that this is just not going to work. And they ended up divorcing because he was gay. So he's into his 30s before he realizes that he's gay. So that's a place where your identity development, his identity development as a gay man didn't happen until well into adulthood. And so that's the other thing that can happen with your gay and lesbian identity development. The other thing that happens with identity development for your lesbian and gay individuals is that it's complicated by the dominant heterosexual identity in our culture. Because it's assumed in our culture that everyone's heterosexual. And it's sort of assumed in teenage years that, of course, the person you fall in love with, the person that you're attracted to, is going to be the opposite sex person. So somebody who's not attracted to the opposite sex person kind of initially feels like, wait a second, what's wrong with me? There must be something wrong with me, unless they happen to grow up in an environment where that's more normalized. They're going to feel like there's something wrong with them. They're more likely to suppress or repress that. It's just going to be a more complicated process accepting their sexual identity, because the media images are heterosexual media images. It's just a more difficult process. And then how they present themselves once they kind of accept their sexual identity. How do they present themselves as a lesbian woman or a gay man? Well, there's just a huge array of self-presentations. For gay men, that can range from your very stereotypical, feminized gay man with the limp wrist. I mean, your ultra stereotypical one that's presented in the movies, flamboyant, okay, all the way through to the hyper-masculine, muscular, okay. And in point of fact, the very muscular gay man is a very dominant self-presentation right now for gay men. It's a very desirable image for gay men right now. In some ways, it's a way of combating homophobia, to appear very muscular, and everything in between. So you can't tell on the basis of how someone looks whether or not they're a gay man. And the same thing's true for lesbian women. So just like with the gay man, you can't tell by how someone presents themselves whether they're lesbian or not. There's not really kind of a standard way of self-presentation. For bisexual, just like for lesbian and gay, that generally, very generally develops around puberty. Probably less likely than for lesbian and gay identity to develop earlier. You get less likelihood with the bisexual individual to feel different from your same-sex peers with the bisexual individual than the lesbian and gay individual. More likely with the bisexual individual to extend that identity development into adulthood. What you get with the bisexual individual is someone, you may find a bisexual person who finds that identity development in puberty or college and finds that they're equally attracted to both sexes at that point in time. But you may find the person who is sexually attracted to, say, an opposite sex partner, because that's what's enforced by the dominant heterosexuality. They may meet that person, date that person, marry that person, okay? Stay in that marriage for 15, 20 years, divorce, go into the dating realm, and all of a sudden find themselves attracted to a same-sex partner at 50, 55, 60 years old. Find themselves developing a bisexual identity. Okay? And that's one of the ways that a bisexual identity can develop as well. So you may get an even more extended identity development timeline for the bisexual identity. The bisexual identity is not only complicated by the dominant heterosexual identity, but it's also complicated by the lesbian and gay identity. Because what the bisexual gets told is make up your mind. Choose one. Okay? You're just being indecisive. The attitude is something like, you know, you have to pick. Whereas for the bisexual person, it's like, well, but I'm equally attracted to both. I'm attracted to the person, not the gender. Is what the bisexual person says, and they genuinely mean that. Whereas for the perspective of the heterosexual or the gay man or the lesbian woman, that just doesn't make sense. And their self-presentations vary even more broadly. And there is no standard self-presentation for the bisexual individual. I don't even think there's a stereotypical presentation for the bisexual individual. Okay, transgender. Transgender identity does not develop during puberty. It actually begins development at around 2 to 4 years old, which is when our identity as male and female begins to develop. What happens is at about that time period, we begin to say, when we begin to talk, we begin to say to our families, I'm a girl, I'm a boy. Okay? And our families say back to us, if I'm a girl and I look physically like a girl, our families say back to us, yeah, you're right, you're a girl. Or if I say I'm a boy and I have a penis, our families say, yeah, you're right, you're a boy. For the transgender person who says, I'm a girl, your family says, no, no, you're not a girl, you have a penis, you're a boy. And the person says, no, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. And there's just round and round and round that goes back and forth as the person and their family argues about whether they're a boy or a girl. So the transgender child and their family get into this struggle over whether I'm going to be a boy or a girl. And to a certain extent, and this differs depending on the individual or not, the transgender identity goes under the surface to some degree or other. Okay? Eventually, it comes back to the surface. And the transgender individual will resurface their transgender identity and reassert themselves and say, no, no. I may physically, you may think I'm a boy, I'm a girl. Okay? And that's the point where they will begin to self-present as their identified gender. Okay? The transgender individual, as I said before, feels like they've been born into the wrong body. Okay? Okay? That feeling that they've been born into the wrong body gets resolved when they've reasserted that presenting as their identified gender, and they resolve that by cross-dressing. Okay? So if they've been physically born male, they cross-dress as female. They may take hormones to help their body be more like their identified gender, or they may resort to surgery, in which case we use the term transsexual to talk about somebody who altered their body to be more like their identified gender. Okay, and that's the terminology that we use there. And the way we use the terminology is if somebody is biologically male and moves to identify as female, we say they're male to female transgender. Or if they've had surgery, they're male to female transsexual. Okay? Or if they are going to have surgery, we would say they're a male to female preoperative transsexual. Now, in your cases, the whole issue of transsexuality is irrelevant for your jobs because you're all dealing with under 18 and they're not going to have surgery until they're over 18. So all of what you're going to be dealing with is transgender. Okay? And probably they're not going to be on hormones. So anybody that you're dealing with is going to be cross-dressing. And if they are kind of out as a transgendered person, they're going to be presenting as their identified self and not as their genital self. The statistics are that about 10% of the population experience same-sex attraction. Okay? So I would expect about 20 of those to have same-sex attraction. That's not the same as being gay or lesbian. Okay? About 2 to 4% of the population identifies as gay or lesbian. So I would expect of your 200, about 4 to 8 of those to identify as gay or lesbian. Okay? About 2% of the population would, and that's real. There haven't been good population studies of transgender because that's a real problematic population to study, but approximately 2% of the population is transgender. So probably about 4 would be transgender. The person who's truly transgendered may tell you, maybe. But the fact is, you've had probably 4 people who've come through over the last year, and only 1 has let you know. And you think about how many years some of you have worked here, and how many transgendered kids have let you know, and how many should have. Mostly they're not talking. And that's going to mostly be the case. It's mostly they're not going to talk. Okay, intersex. By the way, that's the international symbol for intersex. Just thought you might be curious. The development depends on the type of intersex. One of the ways that somebody can be intersex is that they can have genitalia that differ from normally developing genitalia. Somebody who's male can have what's called a micropenis, or a penis that is smaller than the normal penis. And what used to be standard medical practice is that as when an infant was born with a micropenis, they would be surgically altered. Generally, they would be surgically altered to be girls. Or they could have a larger than normal clitoris. And again, that would be surgically altered to be a more normal size. Those individuals, particularly those boys, would develop more like a transgendered individual. They would feel like they were born into the wrong body because, of course, they're being raised as girls, but they were born boys, so of course they would feel like they were born into the wrong body because they're being raised girls. Other intersex would be things like androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is where somebody has an XY chromosome, but because their body is insensitive to androgens, they have female primary and secondary genitalia. They will develop more like gay and lesbian identities. They'll develop more along the lines in puberty. Or the congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is where somebody has an XX chromosome, but male primary and secondary genitalia, again, develops more like gay and lesbian genital development. And intersex will present as identified gender, which may or may not match the biological gender. Queer and questioning developmentally usually occurs around puberty. Let me make a distinction here between queer and genderqueer. When you use the term queer just by itself, that usually refers to sexual orientation, and it's somebody who calls into question the predominance of heterosexuality as a sexual orientation. The term genderqueer is somebody who calls into question the binary system of gender. So somebody who expresses their transgender by cross-dressing. Another term for that would be genderqueer. Or somebody who is just male or female but doesn't like the binary system of expression. I've had students in my classes who dress purely androgynously so that you can't tell whether they're male or female. Drives their classmates utterly crazy. Because, of course, one of the things that we most want to know about the person when we first meet is, are you a boy or a girl? And when their classmates can't tell, and they won't answer the question, are you a boy or a girl, it makes them really crazy. And that's being genderqueer. Questioning is an identity stage. A lot of times we think of questioning as being on our way to deciding whether we are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. But in point of fact, people can be questioning all their lives. They may stay that way. They just are questioning. I don't know what my sexual orientation is, and I spend my life not knowing what my sexual orientation is. That's just who I am. I don't know what my sexual orientation is. Coming out. First and most important rule of thumb here is if a person does not want to be recognized as LGBTIQ, they're not going to be recognized. If they don't want to come out, they don't want you to know it, you're not going to know it. Okay? As indicated by the fact that you've had one person come out as transgender. You can make coming out more likely by creating safe spaces. You're doing a pretty good job of that with your LGB people. You can do a better job with that. One of the ways of doing that is to identify staff people who are willing to talk about that by including symbols that, hey, I'm a safe person to talk to. Some of the symbols, probably the most well-known one is the LGBTIQ flag, the rainbow flag. It can occur just in a flag form or in some other form like the upside-down triangle, which is otherwise known as the safe zone flag. The safe zone symbol can also occur as an upside-down pink triangle. Or you can get the bisexual equal sign. There are other symbols. A search of the internet will find innumerable different kinds of symbols. These are just some of the most common ones. But if you want one general sign, I would pick the rainbow flag as just a generic sign. The other thing that you can do is use non-gendered language whenever possible. For example, say people instead of he, him, he, she. Hey people, it's time for lunch. Instead of, hey guys, it's time for lunch. If you say, hey people, it's time for lunch, you've included everybody, regardless of whether they're male, female, or how they identify. And you don't have to worry about whether you've got any transgender people in there. Hey residents, it's another good one. Yeah, that works very well, non-gendered language. If you're going to talk about their significant others, say significant other instead of boyfriend or girlfriend. And again, that includes people of different sexual orientations and is automatically inclusive. And those kinds of moves help reassure people who are transgendered, LGB, without you having to do anything else. They create safe spaces. A lot of times people refer to coming out in stages. I prefer to talk about it as coming out in pieces because stages imply a linear movement, and I don't find that it happens in a linear movement. We go back and forth. So these are some of the pieces of coming out. One of them is that there's an identity question. Am I straight? Am I lesbian? Am I gay? Am I transgender? Am I male? Am I female? A lot of times this involves denial, confusion, anger, sadness. There's some kind of emotion, frequently a negative emotion, that goes along with this identity question. Then there will be some kind of internal identity acceptance. Okay? Yes, I'm female. Yes, I'm lesbian. Okay? That doesn't mean that I'm happy about it or I'm proud of it, but I've accepted it. This piece usually begins some kind of education process about what it means to be LGBTIQ. Okay? What it means to be a gay man, a bisexual woman, that kind of thing. Support is another piece. Okay? You may start to come out to close friends, begin to elicit support from them. If you don't get support from those close friends, you will shut down that coming out process. If you do get support from them, you'll start coming out to more people. You may start to socialize with, if you're coming out as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, you may socialize with other lesbian, gay, or bisexual acquaintances. If you're coming out as transgender, you may socialize with people who are transgender, just beginning, again, to get support from the community. Another piece of coming out is pride. And this is where you start to feel happy with your sexual orientation or gender identity. And you begin coming out to more people. Okay. Not necessarily to family yet, by the way. If you are intersex, you've already come out to family, but anybody else, you may not have come out to family yet. But pride, you start to come out to more people. And you begin to explore the LGBTQI culture. You begin to develop relationships, okay? And by relationships, I mean romantic relationships. You may or may not develop a sexual exploration phase, okay? This is probably more relevant to the LGB section of the population. You may start dating in the relationship stage, develop more romantic relationships. You begin to come out to family. And this actually, for many people, may be the most difficult coming out process, but not coming out to family may feel really dislocating and create a huge bridge or gap between yourself and your family, and may feel really create a big hole in people's lives. So that's a really difficult piece for many people. The fact that coming out is really hard, but not coming out creates a big hole. It's a real dilemma. Okay. For the families, parents in particular may grieve their views, particularly of marriage and childbearing. If their child comes out as gay or lesbian, they may grieve their view of heterosexual marriage and childbearing. If their child comes out as transgender, they may grieve their view of their child marrying as a woman or a man and bearing or fathering children. And it may take their parents a while to realize that their child can still have a relationship and have children and raise a family. They may just do it differently. So it may take the family a while to adjust. Okay. Eventually, people reach a stage of balance, at least for a while. Then they may go out of balance, and then they come back. And balance is when being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, or questioning is just another part of who you are. Okay? It's not all of who you are, it's just another piece. Okay? Okay. So, where a resident is in the coming out process is going to change how they react and act and how they disclose who they are, regarding their LGBTIQ status while they're in juvenile detention. Okay? Probably most of your kids are going to be in the earlier pieces. They're going to be in the identity question, maybe the early stages of acceptance, maybe in support. Okay? I would be really surprised if you had a few who were in pride. I would be really surprised, but probably in the first three pieces. Okay, a couple things about sexual development. It's really normal for youth to question their sexual orientation. Okay? It is really normal for adolescents to experience attraction to same-sex partners. That's a normal part of sexual development. It's part of the normal confusion of adolescence. Okay. Just because somebody has a same-sex attraction in adolescence does not mean they're gay or lesbian. Okay. And eventually most adolescents figure that out and decide that. And it's one of the really confusing things about being gay or lesbian is you have a same-sex attraction and you're like, okay, am I gay or lesbian or am I not? And then my friend's like, well, yeah, I had a same-sex attraction, but now I'm dating an opposite-sex partner. Why don't you date an opposite-sex partner? Well, because I'm not attracted to them. So it makes it harder for the gay or lesbian adolescent because of that really volatile, confusing adolescent time period. The timing of identification of sexual orientation varies, as I indicated earlier. Individuals may know their sexual orientation early on, or they may not know their sexual orientation until adulthood. Okay. But other than that, sexual development is really the same. Okay. There's not much else to say about that. Questions about sexual development as it relates to GLBTIQ? Okay. Sexual abuse or harassment. Youth bullied due to sexual orientation had a lower quality of life and higher suicide attempts than any other group. So bullying due to sexual orientation is a really serious problem. From what I saw of your facility, the odds of a youth being bullied due to their sexual orientation are really low because of the way your facility is set up. So I think that's probably not a problem for you guys, but it is an issue that needs to be really high on everyone's radar screen, because if it happens, it has really serious consequences. The reported incidence of sexual abuse and forced intercourse for heterosexual girls was 10% to 25%. For lesbian and bisexual girls was 25% to 50%. For heterosexual boys was less than 10%. Now, I take that with a grain of salt because I think that's an underreporting issue. For bisexual boys was 25%. For gay boys was 20%. Which I think there's some interesting statistics. I think it's really interesting, particularly given that boys are less likely to report, that bisexual and gay boys have reported as high a percentage as they have of forced sex and intercourse. LGBT youth who underwent early identity formation were more than twice as likely to have been sexually abused as those who formed their LGBT identity later. And child sexual abuse was associated with higher drive for muscularity in gay and bisexual men. Okay. So there's some interesting things here with child sexual abuse and gay and lesbian, bisexual identity development in there. I don't know necessarily what you make of all of that for your jobs, but I think it's food for thought. I think that it's quite likely that kids who identify as GLB who come into your facility have been sexually abused. I think that's probably the predominant thing that I would take away from that. Childhood sexual abuse of trans people was associated with increased suicidal ideation, increased suicide attempts, increased alcohol abuse, increased illegal substance use, and in adult prison population, transgendered prisoners who are housed according to birth genital assignments face greater risk of sexual abuse, harassment, and assaults. Now, that doesn't apply to your facility. And because the way that prisoners are housed in adult prisons are not the way the residents are housed in your facility. Okay? But again, something to keep in mind. Particularly, since one of the questions that one of your staff people had said was evaluating what is reasonable to expect for a trans person's evaluation of their own safety, given that trans people here in Springfield hang together, it's quite likely that a trans youth will have hung out with adult trans people. And if they've talked to an adult trans person who's been in prison, they are quite likely to feel themselves to be at risk. Okay? And they're quite likely to feel themselves to be at risk of assault and sexual abuse, which is probably why they're not going to talk. And they're not going to mention that they're a trans person. Okay. If you're going to have a conversation with transgender or intersex residents, you want to be clear, first of all, that you respect their presenting gender, and be explicit that the law requires you to do searches in housing center, et cetera, by genital status, not by presenting gender. At least that was the way I understood the standards. So I understand that your name's Lisa. You're a girl. I know you're a girl. The law requires that we house you by genital status, and that's the law, and I can't do anything about that. Okay. Having said that, where would the law put you? And I would ask them to identify that. Would the law put you in the girl can or the boy can? Either the girl box or the boy box. Which box would the law put you? Have them identify that. And go with their identification. If you find out later that that's not where the law would put them, you can always change that. But that gives them the right of self-selection. A couple of resources you may find useful. The Intersex Society of North America has the single best set of resources on intersex that I have found any place. I would strongly recommend it, and I've given the web link here. The APA answers to your question about transgendered people has probably the best set of resources in a single place about transgender, and they really do have a good FAQ set of answers there. If you want to know more about LGB culture, this is a really good website, and it's a really good kind of hip and happening website, so it might be a good place if you want to understand your youth and kind of where they're coming from. Health issues, and not just health issues, but a whole lot of issues, parenting, abuse, just a wide range of topics. I really recommend this NIH website for LGBT issues.